33,000. That is the exact number of Russian aerial targets completely erased from the sky in a single month. Not by multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles, but by a networked swarm of Interceptor drones that cost less than a used laptop. For years, Vladimir Putin engineered what he believed was an inescapable attrition trap. The strategic calculus was brutal and deliberate. Bleed the West dry by forcing Ukraine to fire defensive missiles that cost dozens of times more than the cheap disposable drones sent to trigger them. It was a mathematical guarantee of exhaustion. But inventions are born out of absolute necessity. Faced with the total depletion of their air defense grid, Kiev did not just find a stopgap measure. They architected a paradigm shift that has turned the skies over Eastern Europe into a terminal graveyard for Russian air assets. The equation has irreversibly flipped. How exactly did a desperate makeshift solution mutate into an industrial-scale slaughterhouse for Russian air superiority? To understand the sheer scale of this aerial slaughter, you have to examine the anatomy of the kill. The Interceptor drone is a masterclass in lethal simplicity. Unlike traditional lumbering air defense systems, these platforms are cheap, relentlessly lightweight, and designed for pure mass production. Consider the Sting, a 3D printed platform developed by Wild Hornets featuring an aerodynamic, bullet-shaped chassis. Approved by NATO, this kinetic missile alternative absolutely shreds the sky, reaching terminal intercept speeds exceeding 340 kilometers per hour. That is significantly faster than the Shahed drones it relentlessly hunts. Operating at an altitude of 7 kilometers, the Sting does not rely on blind luck. It is governed by a highly sophisticated, AI-assisted guidance system paired with thermal optics developed by Kerbis and Odd Systems. This allows the platform to lock onto the thermal signature of a Russian drone in the dead of night, before violently detonating a 500-gram warhead to obliterate the target in midair. It is a surgical decapitation of an enemy asset, scattering debris harmlessly over open terrain rather than populated civilian centers. But tactical speed is entirely irrelevant without operational reach. This is where the kinetic reality on the ground perfectly aligns with modern naval intelligence paradigms on remote over-the-horizon engagement. The traditional frontline has been systematically decoupled from the operator. In April, the Bulava unit shattered the parameters of modern drone warfare when an operator known as Hulk intercepted 2 Shaheds from a standoff distance of 500 kilometers, neutralizing them without ever being exposed to physical danger. Yet even that record was dismantled just weeks later. By April 17th, Wild Hornets executed a remote kill from an astonishing 2,000 kilometers away. An operator sitting securely in an apartment outside of Ukraine's borders watched a Russian Shahed cross the Ukrainian sky in high-definition video and shredded it from thousands of kilometers away. This terrifying operational reach is powered by the Hornet Vision Control System, a digital ecosystem providing low-latency control that entirely neutralizes traditional signal degradation and completely disconnects operators from the immediate kill zone. If you want to understand the brutal realities of modern warfare and the geopolitical shifts actively ignored by mainstream media, subscribe to the channel right now. We strip away the propaganda to deliver the unvarnished strategic intelligence you actually need. This extreme scalability has completely rewritten the doctrine of airspace denial. Historically, a single drone operator was required to monitor a fragmented 20 to 30 kilometer grid. Now, a solitary crew commands and protects hundreds of kilometers of territory. Take the Foxtrot crew of the 38th Air Defense Regiment. In a single 24-hour shift, one crew systematically hunted down and erased 30 Russian drones, including 28 Shaheds and 2 Gerberas, utilizing Sting interceptors. What was once considered an isolated experimental success is now a routine, mechanized slaughter. But achieving localized tactical superiority is fundamentally useless without the industrial capacity to sustain it. You can build the most lethal interceptor on the planet, but how exactly do you feed a logistical beast that demands 33,000 targets a month? The mathematics of this conflict have devolved into a terminal failure for Moscow. To comprehend the magnitude of this shift, one must view the battlefield through the cold, unforgiving lens of defense economics. Vladimir Putin's initial strategy relied on a classic attrition trap, deliberately forcing Ukraine and its Western allies to exhaust expensive strategic reserves by firing multi-million-dollar missiles to destroy remarkably cheap drones. It was an equation explicitly set up to deplete interceptor stockpiles and bankrupt Ukraine's air defense grid. But the introduction of the P-1 Sun Interceptor, a fully 3D-printed modular platform produced by Skyfall, has violently transformed that trap into an economic guillotine for the Kremlin. At a manufacturing cost of merely around $1,000, the P-1 Sun officially ranks as the absolute cheapest air defense system deployed in the entirety of the war. The operational process for these interceptors costs 1/1000th that of firing a Patriot missile, fundamentally upending the cost asymmetry of the contested airspace. But the strategic genius of the P-1 Sun is not solely rooted in its aggressive price tag. It lies in a deliberate, almost insulting technological simplicity that systematically shatters Russia's most sophisticated electronic warfare doctrines. Modern Russian military strategy is heavily predicated on dominant electronic warfare capabilities, designed to jam signals and sever the connection between drones and their operators. The Ukrainian countermeasure is devastatingly simple, a fiber optic linked version of the interceptor. Because this specific variant is controlled via a continuous physical cable spooled out during its flight path, traditional signal jamming simply does not work. This profoundly low-tech integration completely neutralizes Russia's multi-million-dollar electronic warfare systems, rendering their electromagnetic dominance absolutely useless against the incoming kinetic strike. According to paradigms closely mirroring recent Financial Times analyses on defense industrial resilience, modern wars of attrition are ultimately decided not by the courage of the infantry, but by the elasticity and output of the industrial base. And this is precisely where the Russian state apparatus is actively bleeding out. Moscow is desperately attempting to adapt to this new reality. They are aggressively deploying foam plastic decoys, such as the Gerbera and Parity models, integrating them into roughly 30% of their attack waves. These decoy drones are explicitly designed to act as sponges, built to deplete the swarms of cheap interceptors. However, Ukraine's AI-powered thermal cameras effortlessly distinguish the genuine lethal heat signatures from the foam decoys, ensuring that the number of interceptors wasted on these desperate ploys is steadily decreasing. When Russia attempts to escalate the airspace threat by accelerating the deployment of faster jet-powered Shahed variants, Ukraine simply fields the hybrid jet-powered Bullet model. This advanced platform easily responds to the threat by reaching speeds of 600 kilometers per hour, successfully intercepting Russia's newest tech. Russia is even attempting to bolt air-to-air missiles onto their drones and mandate more daytime attacks in a frantic bid to mitigate the thermal camera advantage. Yet none of these panicked measures eliminate Ukraine's fundamental advantage, the brutal reality of cost asymmetry. A Ukrainian interceptor costs between $1,000 and $2,500, while every single Russian solution developed to evade it is exponentially more expensive. The industrial disparity between the two nations is staggering. Through the Brave One Defense Innovation Cluster, Ukraine has built a multi-channel procurement mechanism that ensures an uninterrupted, lethal flow of hardware. If one supply channel fails, the others immediately step in. The scale of this decentralized production is almost incomprehensible. Over 10,000 Sting drones are systematically produced each month. Furthermore, an ecosystem of more than 280 distinct companies are aggressively developing over 550 active solutions. Every single month, new companies join, new models undergo rigorous testing, and existing platforms are lethally optimized. Contrast this agile hyperproduction with the rotting architecture of the Russian military-industrial complex. Russia's centralized production pace for counter-technology simply cannot keep up. International sanctions are violently constraining their supply chains, while an aggressive shortage of skilled workers has reached a catastrophic 4.8 million individuals. Worse still, an archaic Soviet-era bureaucracy is actively paralyzing and slowing down critical innovation. Even the Kremlin's most fervent mouthpieces, like the propagandist Mikhail Zvinchuk, have openly admitted the dire nature of this situation. The inescapable reality they must now accept is that Ukraine can launch highly effective interceptors from extreme distances with absolute impunity. Russia is bleeding out economically in a war of industrial stamina They are mathematically guaranteed to lose. The Kremlin's budget is being systematically drained by weapons that cost a fraction of their own countermeasures. But while the economic guillotine slowly descends on Moscow's treasury, it is the resulting tactical blindness in the sky that is causing a literal, unmitigated slaughter of their infantry on the ground. What began as a desperate localized defense mechanism in the skies over Kiev has aggressively mutated into a structural pillar of global security. The conflict in Eastern Europe is no longer merely a war of national survival. It has become a live-fire laboratory dictating the future of international defense architectures. We are witnessing the aggressive implementation of what strategists now call drone diplomacy, a concept that is now an integral, non-negotiable part of Ukraine's foreign policy. This autonomous technology, born directly out of the brutal necessity of the war in Ukraine, is rapidly becoming a highly coveted global export product and a massive diplomatic asset. Recent Chatham House assessments on European security restructuring explicitly recognize that the traditional umbrella of American defense guarantees is being fundamentally reevaluated. Nations bordering Russia are no longer waiting for expensive, multi-year procurement cycles of Western missiles. They are moving to adopt the asymmetric, hyper-lethal blueprint that Ukraine has validated in blood. The panic in Eastern Europe has crystallized into definitive strategic alignment. Poland is not merely observing this technological shift, they are internalizing it for their own national survival. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk formally announced that Ukraine's unparalleled drone expertise will be fused with massive Polish and European Union funds to actively create an Interceptor fleet. Tusk bluntly acknowledged the geopolitical reality, stating that Ukraine's unique, battle-tested experience in combat with unmanned aerial vehicles will structurally help protect Poland and the broader European Union from inevitable future air attacks. The Nordic flank is moving with equal urgency. The Norwegian government has signed a sweeping joint drone production agreement, strategically layered on top of an unprecedented $7 billion defense aid package. The industrial wheels are already turning, as thousands of medium-range drones are slated to be produced on Norwegian soil, with operational deliveries beginning as early as this summer. The Norwegian defense minister explicitly described this cold calculus as a critical collaboration that mutually benefits both countries and rapidly strengthens Norway's domestic defense industry against Russian encroachment. This posture of aggressive, technology-driven deterrence is echoing across the Baltics. Estonia, perpetually existing in the crosshairs of Russian aggression, has proactively signed new agreements regarding unmanned aerial vehicle procurement and advanced anti-drone technologies. They are literally allocating 0.25% of their entire gross domestic product solely to support Ukraine, a financial move that directly buys them access to this defensive data. President Zelensky has capitalized on this momentum, definitively announcing that the ultimate spending priorities within the massive €90 billion support package from the European Union will be unapologetically directed toward autonomous drone systems. But the true geopolitical earthquake is radiating far beyond the borders of Europe, striking directly at the heart of the Middle East. The implications of this 3D-printed architecture are terrifying to any nation facing the specter of Iranian proxy swarms. 6 distinct defense industry agreements have already been formally signed with Azerbaijan, and elite Ukrainian experts are currently providing crucial on-site support for air defense specifically calibrated against Iranian-style attacks. The Gulf states are watching the Russian attrition trap fail, and they are taking notes. Wealthy, heavyweight nations, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have begun showing serious, financially backed interest in acquiring Ukrainian interceptors. These strategic partners in the Middle East desperately want to integrate Ukraine's battle-proven anti-drone architecture into their own highly vulnerable national defenses. This technology is of absolute vital importance, especially for countries perpetually facing the asymmetrical Iranian drone threat that has historically bypassed expensive traditional Western radar nets. They recognize that if a $1,000 fiber-optic interceptor can erase a Shahed over Odessa, it can erase a Houthi or Iranian munition over Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. This technology is actively rewriting global defense doctrines from the Baltic Sea to the Persian Gulf. It is an entirely new world order built on fiber optic cables, thermal optics, and decentralized hyperproduction. But while the international community rushes to purchase the blueprint of tomorrow's wars, back on the shattered Ukrainian front lines, this exact same technology has violently resurrected a very specific, bleeding nightmare, one that the Kremlin desperately thought it had buried in the mountains of Afghanistan 4 decades ago. History possesses a dark, unforgiving sense of irony, and for the Russian High Command, it is currently repeating a very specific, agonizing lesson. To understand the psychological collapse actively accelerating within the Russian ranks, we must examine historical CIA and naval intelligence post-mortems detailing the systemic erosion of Soviet morale during the late 1980s. In 1986, the Soviet Union operated under the arrogant assumption of absolute, unquestionable air superiority in Afghanistan. Their heavy Mi-24 Hind helicopters and Su-25 attack aircraft were brutally crushing the Afghan resistance from the sky, operating with near impunity. Then, the CIA supplied the Mujahideen with FM-92 Stinger shoulder-fired missiles. Almost overnight, a portable weapon costing between $20,000 and $30,000 began systematically erasing multi-million-dollar Soviet aircraft from the operational theater. The physical losses were devastating. Approximately 270 Soviet aircraft were entirely destroyed, but the psychological mutilation of the Soviet forces was terminal. The sudden, pervasive fear of death from the sky utterly shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility, permanently paralyzing helicopter support, leaving critical supply lines brutally exposed and triggering a total collapse in frontline troop morale. Now, Vladimir Putin's Russia is suffering through the exact same nightmare, but the mathematical scale of this technological slaughter is exponentially worse. The original Afghan Stingers were inherently limited by human sightlines and a functional range of just a few kilometers. Furthermore, they were available only in strictly limited quantities. Today, Ukraine's Interceptor drone fleets are being surgically controlled from 2,000 kilometers away, and the Brave 1 cluster is hyper-producing 10,000 of these interceptors every single month. They are hunting down Russian aerial targets of any type, at any altitude, with absolute ruthlessness. The psychological terror of the Stinger, the paralyzing fear that airspace is no longer survivable, has now fully infected Russian drone operators and frontline commanders alike. But the most catastrophic impact of these interceptor fleets isn't restricted to the sky. It is directly dictating the brutal mathematics of survival in the mud of the trenches. In March of 2026, Russian ground forces suffered an agonizing 35,351 casualties, marking the absolute highest monthly attrition figure of the entire war. A staggering 96% of these casualties were the direct, violent result of drone strikes. The tactical domino effect is terrifyingly efficient. When Ukrainian interceptors systematically hunt and destroy Russian reconnaissance drones like the Zala and Orlan, they effectively gouge out the eyes of Russian artillery. Because the artillery units can no longer identify coordinates, they cannot fire accurately, preserving Ukrainian defensive positions from heavy bombardment. Simultaneously, Ukraine has aggressively deployed automated ground robots to execute over 9,000 dangerous logistics missions, drastically reducing their own infantry exposure to zero-line fire. When this absolute airspace denial is perfectly synchronized with autonomous ground logistics, Ukraine has engineered a horrifying 1-to-5 casualty ratio. For every single Ukrainian soldier lost, 5 Russian soldiers are permanently erased from the battlefield. The drone fear is so pervasive that Russian units are encountering lethal swarms while still massing at their initial assembly points, paralyzing rotations and devastating unit cohesion before they even engage in combat. It is the brutal reality of a collapsing 20th century army, hopelessly trapped under a sky it no longer controls. In less than 2 years, the fundamental architecture of modern warfare has been violently rewritten. At the onset of this conflict, Russia confidently weaponized its cheap drone swarms to deliberately deplete Ukraine's highly expensive, Western-supplied missile reserves. Today, that strategic equation has completely flipped. Ukraine is now utilizing a massive decentralized fleet of ultra-cheap AI-driven drones to systematically destroy Russia's cheap drones. It is a permanent, irreversible shift. The era of firing a $4 million Patriot missile at a scrap metal Shahed is dead. This ecosystem, tested in the skies over Crimea, proven in the blood of Donetsk, and expanded aggressively across the Black Sea, has permanently altered the definition of global air defense. Russia simply does not possess the time, the technological agility, or the financial resources to resist this violent paradigm shift. Every single night, as another burning Shahed falls from the Ukrainian sky, it proves that the future of warfare definitively belongs to autonomous systems. The geopolitical board is resetting, which brings us to the ultimate strategic question. As NATO and Middle Eastern powers scramble to adopt this exact Ukrainian Interceptor blueprint, which major global military power stands to lose the absolute most from the sudden devaluation of traditional, multi-billion-dollar Air Force doctrines? Drop your strategic analysis in the comments below.